April 9th, 1865, a muddy crossroads in rural Virginia. In a modest farmhouse, two men are about to end the bloodiest conflict in American history. One arrives in an immaculate grey uniform, buttons polished to perfection. The other covered in dust and mud from days of hard riding. What happened in that room would reshape a nation. But the road to this moment was paved with desperation, starvation, and one final impossible gamble. This is the story of how the Confederacy died. By early 1865, Petersburg, Virginia had become a living tomb. For 9 months, over 100,000 men lived in trenches stretching nearly 40 miles around the city. They were starving, they were freezing, and they were losing hope. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was trapped, slowly being strangled by Ulysses S. Grant's relentless siege, but Lee wasn't ready to surrender, not yet. In July 1864, a group of Pennsylvania coal miners had an audacious idea: dig a tunnel under Confederate lines, pack it with explosives, and blow a hole straight into Petersburg. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants, sketched out the plan: 511 feet, straight under enemy territory. Grant thought it was impossible, but gave permission anyway. What did they have to lose? For weeks these miners dug in total darkness with makeshift tools, every shovel of dirt bringing them closer to the enemy. The Confederates heard them digging. They tried to find the tunnel with their own countermines. They failed. By late July, 4 tons of gunpowder sat in a gallery beneath Confederate Fort Elliott. The fuse was lit at 3:30 a.m. on July 30th. At 4:44 in the morning, the earth erupted. 278 Confederate soldiers died instantly, vaporized or buried alive. A crater, 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep, now existed where a fort once stood. It should have been a Union breakthrough. Instead, it became one of the war's greatest disasters. The assault force, hastily changed at the last minute due to political concerns about using black troops, had no idea what to do. Their commander, James Ledlie, was drunk in a bunker behind the lines. Instead of going around the crater, confused Union soldiers climbed down into it. The steep walls became a trap. Confederate artillery, recovering from the shock, turned the crater into a killing zone. Bodies piled on bodies, nearly 4,000 Union casualties. Grant called it the saddest affair I have witnessed in this war. The siege continued. Month after month, Lee's men deserted by the hundreds every week. They were eating rats, boiling shoe leather for soup. By February 1865, the Army of Northern Virginia was dissolving, but 400 miles south, another story was unfolding. William Tecumseh Sherman had just completed his infamous march to the sea, carving a path of destruction through Georgia. Grant wanted him to come north by sea to help finish Lee. Sherman had a different idea. He would march through the Carolinas, destroying every rail line, every supply depot, every factory that kept Lee's army alive. Not just defeat the South, but make them understand they had lost. On January the 1st, 1865, Sherman's 60,000 veterans entered South Carolina, the birthplace of secession, the state that started it all. His men needed no encouragement for what came next. Confederate commanders thought the winter roads were impassable. Sherman proved them wrong, using former slaves as engineers to build corduroy roads across flooded swamps. His army moved like a ghost, confusing defenders about his true target. Was it Charleston, Augusta, Columbia? On February 17th, Sherman entered Columbia, South Carolina's capital. That night, the city burned. For years, Southerners claimed Sherman ordered it. He didn't. High winds, abandoned cotton bales, set alight by retreating Confederates, and drunk soldiers from both sides turned Columbia into an inferno. 1/3 of the city was destroyed. The message was clear: the Confederacy was finished. By March, Sherman was in North Carolina. Union forces were closing from every direction. At Bentonville, Confederate General Joseph Johnston made one last desperate attack on Sherman's columns. His army of 20,000 men, cobbled together from scattered remnants, briefly drove back the Union left flank. Then Sherman's reinforcements arrived. Johnston pulled back. He sent a telegram to Lee, "I cannot stop Sherman without help." There would be no help. Back in Petersburg, Lee was planning his escape. His 40,000 remaining soldiers couldn't hold the trenches much longer. His plan was desperate but simple. Break out, march south, link up with Johnston, defeat Sherman, then turn back to fight Grant. It was nearly impossible, but it was all he had left. On March 25th, Lee launched his last offensive, a surprise pre-dawn assault on Fort Stedman. For 2 hours, Confederate soldiers briefly broke through Union lines. Then Federal reinforcements arrived. By 8 a.m. it was over. 4,000 Confederate casualties. The gamble had failed. 4 days later, Grant attacked. On April 1st, at Five Forks, Union cavalry and infantry smashed through Lee's right flank. The Confederate commanders were attending a fish bake, too far away to hear the battle through acoustic shadows. By the time they returned, their lines had collapsed. Lee's last supply railroad was cut. The next morning, Grant attacked everywhere at once along the Petersburg line. Lieutenant General A.P. Hill, trying to rally his breaking troops, rode into Union skirmishers and was shot dead. Lee sent a message to Jefferson Davis, "I advise that all preparation be made for leaving Richmond tonight." That evening, the Confederate government fled. Richmond was set ablaze to deny it to the Yankees. 40,000 Confederate soldiers slipped out of the trenches under cover of darkness and began marching west. Grant pursued with 80,000 men. Lee's army was falling apart. Men were collapsing from starvation. Wagons broke down. Artillery had to be abandoned because the horses were too weak to pull them. At Amelia Court House, Lee expected to find supplies. Instead, he found nothing. The food had been sent to the wrong location. Lee lost a full day foraging for food his men never found. That delay was fatal. On April the 6th at Sailor's Creek, Union forces caught and surrounded Lee's rearguard. 7,700 Confederates were captured or killed in a single afternoon. Lee watched from a hillside and said, "My God, has the army dissolved? Not yet, but soon." Lee kept moving west, trying to reach Lynchburg where more supplies waited, but Philip Sheridan's cavalry was relentless, blocking roads, destroying bridges, herding Lee's army like cattle. On April 8th, George Custer's cavalry seized Appomattox Station, capturing the supply trains that were Lee's last hope. Lee was trapped. Union infantry blocked the road ahead. More infantry blocked the road behind. Cavalry blocked both flanks. On the morning of April 9th, Confederate soldiers made one final charge to break through Sheridan's cavalry. They took the ridge. Then they saw what was waiting on the other side. 3 full corps of Union infantry, 28,000 men in perfect battle formation, advancing. There was nothing left to do. At 8 a.m., Robert E. Lee, dressed in his finest uniform with his ceremonial sword, sent a message to Grant requesting a meeting to discuss surrender terms. Grant was riding toward the sound of guns when the message reached him. He'd had a splitting migraine for 2 days. When he read Lee's note, the headache vanished instantly. He sent word back, "Choose the meeting place." By chance, the house selected belonged to Wilmer McLean. 4 years earlier, McLean's home had been used as Confederate headquarters at the First Battle of Bull Run. He'd moved to Appomattox to escape the war. Now, in his front parlor, the war would end. McLean later said, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor." At 3 p.m. in that small room, the two commanders met. Grant, in his muddy uniform, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would be paroled, allowed to keep their horses for spring planting. Officers could keep their sidearms. Rations would be provided. No trials, no hangings, just go home. Lee read the terms he accepted. At 4 p.m., he signed the surrender documents. The Army of Northern Virginia, which had fought for 4 years across a dozen states, which had won impossible victories at Chancellorsville and Second Manassas, which had nearly taken Washington itself, ceased to exist. 5 days later, on April 14th, President Lincoln was assassinated by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. The man who had promised a soft peace would never see it. By April 26th, Joseph Johnston surrendered all remaining Confederate forces east of the Mississippi to Sherman in North Carolina. 89,000 men laid down their arms. Jefferson Davis fled, was captured in Georgia on May 10th, and spent 2 years in prison. The last Confederate general to surrender was Stand Watie, a Cherokee chief, on June 23, 1865. The deadliest war in American history was over. 655,000 soldiers dead, 2.1% of the entire American population. Proportionally, it remains the costliest conflict the United States has ever fought. The South had lost 18% of its pre-war population, its cities were ruins, its economy was shattered, its infrastructure was destroyed. The war to preserve slavery had failed utterly, and in failing it had destroyed the very civilization the Confederacy had fought to protect. 4 million enslaved people were now free. The United States, tested to its breaking point, survived as one nation. At Appomattox Court House, in that modest farmhouse on that spring afternoon, America's bloodiest chapter came to a close, not with grand declarations or dramatic speeches, but with 2 exhausted men shaking hands over the terms of surrender. The Civil War was over. The hard work of reuniting a broken nation was just beginning. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next documentary. We're covering more pivotal moments that shaped American history. What battle or historical event should we explore next? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it with anyone fascinated by history. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.